Morning, YouTubers. On today's episode, I got something interesting for you guys. We're going to be talking about arc force. Now, arc force is something that people coined a long time ago, and it can describe any number of things, some correct, some incorrect, and it creates a lot of confusion. And I wanted to cover this in its own video, separate from everything else, because it's a term that I throw out there a fair amount in my videos, and I want to make sure that you guys understand it. When you understand arc force, you'll also be able to be a better stick welder because it directly relates to that, but you'll also be able to understand welding terminology better. So for today's video, I'm going to do a little bit of welding with a personal favorite rod of mine, 6010, and then another favorite rod of mine, 7024. And we're going to do a lot of comparisons between those. We're also going to throw a little bit of cutting and etching. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll understand the term better. You'll understand what it does, what it doesn't do, and how to adjust it if it applies to what you're doing and if your welder has that capability. So let's get into it. Quick clarification here. I ended up using 7018 for a bunch of the tests. I thought I would do that because 7024 isn't that common and a lot of you guys might not have access to it. So a lot of the welds are going to be 7018. All right, let's do a little bit of book learning here. I'm not a huge fan of just sitting here and talking in front of you guys rather than doing something, but this is kind of important to know, so apologies in advance. So arc force really can define two different things. The first one being the actual, essentially like the drive of the electric arc into the metal, the force in which it drives into the metal, the penetration. And the second thing is arc force can refer to a setting that a particular welder has that's generally used for stick welding that you can adjust, and that increases or decreases the penetration per se. And it's a little bit more complicated, but when I get into that, I'll cover it. So let's talk about the first thing, which is essentially the drive of the electric arc of the process. Now, when you stick weld, which I have a 6010 here, this is known as a high arc force rod. Even if your welder doesn't have a setting for arc force that's adjustable, you can tell in a quick hurry. You strike an arc on this and it sounds kind of like, I don't know, a jet engine of sorts. I guess that's probably a bad way to describe it, but you can tell just the sound of the arc is very harsh, crispy, versus say like 7018 or 7024 that I have over here. Very soft arc, it's quiet, not a lot of sparks. So right away, just between certain stick rods, there's a huge difference in arc force. And the question comes down, well, is it something that you want? Well, if you're welding thick steel, like this is 1/4 inch, and you need to get a real deep penetrating weld on it, or on scabby material, say this had paint or rust, having higher arc force from a process is beneficial. Because what that will do is, rather than laying on top of the steel, it will actually chew away at what's on the surface and get into the base material with minimal prep. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't prep your material, but you get what I'm saying. Now, stick in general, whether it's 6010, 7024, 7018, all of them I would consider to be medium to high arc force processes. And that's simply because no matter what polarity you run, what rod you run, the force in which it transfers the metal from the rod into the metal, your base metal, it has a fair amount of like oomph behind it. Now, when you look at other processes like say short circuit MIG, that would be a medium to low arc force. I would realistically classify it as low. Well, we'll call it medium. I'll argue with myself, medium arc force. It has some arc force as that wire gets fed through into the puddle. There is some push, not only because you're feeding the wire in, but there is some push for penetration. It's just it falls apart on 1/4 inch and thicker metal. MIG just loses the arc force, and you're not going to get very good penetration on thicker metal. Now TIG, like I got over here, this would be considered a very low arc force process. Now, what you're going to find is when you run higher amperages, all that's going to happen is it's going to melt through it, but there's not really much force. Now that's not saying that there's no arc force with this. There is some arc force. Like if you ever weld underneath like a pipe or something and you're welding there, you can, just by the arc existing, will push molten metal up and try and keep it from sagging. So there is arc force here. It's just not very much. So knowing that, what can we somewhat predict? Well, welding with stick rods is going to be a lot more difficult on thin material because no matter what you do, the simple nature of how it transfers metal from the rod to the base material is going to be more likely to blow a hole in it. And the thinner the metal, the worse it gets. And if you watch my other videos, you've seen this firsthand. Like flux core wire welding thin tube, pretty easy. Stick welding thin tube, a lot harder, even with smaller rods. And this is 1/8 inch, but good luck even with this trying to weld sheet metal, not gonna happen. Now TIG, very easy to weld thin material. So higher arc force is not good for sheet metal, generally speaking. For thicker metal, it's not necessarily a detriment, it can actually be a positive. So anyways, enough talking about this. This video isn't gonna be a how to stick weld. I got a ton of videos I'm gonna be shooting regarding that. It's gonna take me a couple weeks to get through all of them. I just wanted to have something for you guys, keep you busy during the week, keep you motivated. So let's actually do some welding and let's get into this. Got 2 rods. I'm going to run 1 bead with each one. I got a 1/8 inch 60-10, 1/8 inch 70-24. You look at the size of the rods, they're the same size. The flux coating, a lot bigger on 70-24. This flux coating is actually going to help deposit more metal in our weld. Therefore, despite the rod diameter being the same, the weld will be a lot bigger with this. This guy I'm going to run at 150 amps. The 60-10 is going to be at 90. So let me run a pass here. That guy was a little bit spicy. 150 amps is probably a little bit too much for this size plate, but hey, it handled it. Now I'm going to switch my welder over to 60-10 settings and let's run a pass. And I'm going to run, I'm going to throw in a 70-18 in this too. All right, I got 3 beads, 70-24, 60-10, and 70-18. Now I left the audio and the video at regular speed. You probably noticed there's a lot of difference in the way each rod sounded. Now, the 70-24, we're running pretty spicy at 150 amps, so that probably popped and sputtered more than it would normally at a reduced setting. But I'm sure you could tell the difference between 60-10 and 70-18. So that has a lot to do with what's called arc force. I'm going to clean these off and we'll talk about it once they're cleaned up. All right, ran 3 beads on plate. Have the 70-24, 60-10, 70-18, all 1/8 inch rods. In the video, I'm sure that you heard differences in how the arcs sound. Now, some of that is, well, this rod 70-24 is running at 150 amps versus 90 for the 60-10 versus 120 for the 70-18. The amperage in itself will change the sound along with the characteristics of the rod will change the sound and the amount of spatter. Now, there's a couple interesting things to just note about this. First off is the 70-24 rod, they're all beads are the same length, but you can see how much is left of this rod still. So didn't even burn anywhere near half. The 60-10, to get this length of weld, burned up probably better than half, and then the 70-18 burned up, I don't know, 60% of the rod or so. So 60-10 does not deposit much metal. The reason I burned off as much as I did is because I slowed my travel speed down and let it fill. And if you notice the width of these 3, they're pretty similar. But now let's get into the actual differences. We're going to do some test welds on a plate and then cut and etch them. So our test setup is a piece of 1/4 inch thick plate. I'm going to run a pass with 70-18 first. And then I'm going to run a pass with 60-10 after this plate's cooled, and then we're going to cut and etch it and compare them. All right, guys, let's see what we got here. I cut the plates, etched them. We have the 60-10 on the bottom, 70-18 on the top. Now the 60-10 is wider, and that's simply because my travel speed is lower. The 60-10 likes to have a wider weld, and that's simply because of the arc cone that comes off is wider than the more direct 70-18. So let's take a look. And I'll actually put these back to back, and I'll put a high detailed up now so you can see what I'm seeing. Now, if you look at these, we can see that the 70-18 has pretty shallow penetration beyond the plate, and that's to be expected. The 60-10, without a doubt, has more penetration beyond the plate. And this is kind of a small scale test to show you the difference in arc force. Now on my welder, I welded both of these rods with the same arc force setting of 30%, just different amperages. And you can see despite having more amperage, the 7018 just did not penetrate more. Had I ran that 6010 at even more amperage, it would have gone even deeper likely for penetration. And this kind of reinforces the differences between the rods themselves. All right, as you saw in the cut and etch, there are differences here. Now, obviously, the astute amongst you is going to say, well, of course, if you slow down the travel speed, the penetration will increase. And to a certain extent, that's true. However, 7018 such as this, if I would have just slowed down my travel speed, it likely would have just humped up the weld more and not really widened out. So the penetration with that really isn't going to increase that much if I would have slowed down. After I shot this video, I thought I was selling it short by not just slowing my travel speed down and comparing it. So the weld on the left, both the top and bottom were 7018. The one on the top, I slowed my travel speed down to deposit a bigger weld, much like you run 6010 at a slower travel speed than 7018, and look at the results. Essentially, the penetration profile is identical, but there's just more weld metal sitting on top. Not ideal. Now this, you can see the 7018 that I ran slower is on the left. It's the same width as a 6010, but obviously the internal penetration is completely different and nowhere near as good. So slowing your travel speed down is not necessarily a benefit for penetration. On thinner wall tube or something maybe, but not on thick plate. Now if I increase my amperage, it might have increased the penetration to a certain extent. But again, there's practical limits to this. Like, you're not going to get a 7018 to perform as good hot as a 6010 that's hot. It's just not going to. And that's because of arc force differences. Now, you're probably wondering, why does 7018 and 6010 have different characteristics? And I'll really simplify this. So the flux that are on these rods, and I'll grab a 7018, this does two things. When an electric arc is established and it heats it up, it vaporizes it and creates a shielding gas for the weld pool, and it also solidifies through the molten metal and deposits on the top to shield that red hot weld from oxygen. So it has two purposes. Well, the 6010 rod creates an atmosphere of CO2 around the weld pool. CO2 creates a hotter weld pool than the gas that 7018 creates, okay? That is the primary difference as to why you get more penetration with 6010 versus 7018. Now, if you do MIG welding, you know that when you run 100% CO2 gas versus C25, that you see slightly better penetration and a more aggressive arc with 100% CO2. The same thing happens with MIG that happens with stick. So that's why, like, this particular rod 6010 has more arc force. It has a different shielding gas that's covering the molten pool and the flux as well. And that shielding gas helps transfer more heat through the arc gap into the metal. Same reason why TIG welding, when you use 100% helium versus 100% argon, the weld with helium has more penetration and is hotter. The reason is that it ups your arc voltage. And that gives another point that I'm going to make here on why, even if I would have increased the amperage, it wouldn't necessarily penetrate deeper with the 7018. A 6010 rod, when it's running, operates at a higher arc voltage than 7018. And there's nothing you can really do to change that. Now with the 7018, if you long arc it, yeah, your arc voltage is going to go up, but you can't control it with a long arc. You have to keep a short arc. So that's essentially what's going on. Difference in shielding gas in the weld pool increases or decreases the arc voltage that is required to maintain an arc. Therefore, the higher the voltage that's required to maintain an arc, the hotter the arc is going to end up being, and then thus the higher the penetration. So that is why with 6010 you get slightly better penetration than you do with most other rods. It's simply because the voltages that it operates at are higher through the arc gap, thus more BTUs of heat energy or more watts are put in. And even to further drive this point home, I'm gonna display my welder output and I'm gonna run a pass with 6010 and with 7018, and I want you to watch the arc voltage. So this first rod is gonna be 7018. Pay attention to the overall average voltage. The second rod I'm running is 1/8 inch 6010. Runs at the same amperage as 332 7018. Nothing else has changed other than changing the rod. Pay attention to the average arc voltage. So let's have a little quick recap here, and then we're going to move on to talk about what welder settings of arc force is actually doing. So recap, very simple. 6010 has more penetration than 7018. It has more arc force because of the shielding gas that's created, increases the arc voltage. Every welding process has different arc force to it, the least being TIG, the most probably being, I would say, 6010 of all conventional welding processes. I mean, there's a lot of other types out there that are done in industry for very thick plate that I'm not even going to discuss here because that's really far beyond this. But what you're going to notice is the differences in these plates really isn't that significant. It's not like you switch to 6010 and all of a sudden you can burn through 1/4 inch plate, both sides of it, and a one-sided weld. That's not going to happen. I mean, the difference, even though it might be 40–50% deeper penetration, that's still not that much. And that's exactly why on thicker weldments that they bevel plates and then do multi-pass to fill it out. And that's simply because most conventional welding processes don't really have that much penetration. Like getting much penetration beyond, I'd say about an 1/8 inch, maybe 1/4, even at very high amperage is very limited. And that's why, like on butt welds, like if you were gonna do a 1/4 inch weld butt weld, you're not gonna put the 2 1/4 inch plates and try and burn them through even with 6010. Like you're gonna bevel them, maybe leave a gap. And that's just because no matter what rod you're running, you really don't have that great a penetration, but there are subtle differences as you saw. So let's talk about arc force as an adjustment. Now on my Miller welder, they call it dig. Different companies call it different things. Most commonly it's called arc force adjustment. Now, arc force adjustment on a welder is generally referring to a stick welding setting. And what that does is it increases the amperage as you tighten the arc. Now, if you watch my welder in that video where you could see the voltages, what it does is it detects what the voltage was at. So say you saw it at like 22 to 30 volts. As the voltage drops, it assumes that your arc gap is dropping, okay, that it's shortening, and then it ups the amperage. So the higher the setting, the more amperage it's going to boost. So in simple terms, say you set your rod at 100 amps for your output. So you're running your rod at 100 amps and its operating voltage is 22 volts when you're just holding a normal arc gap. As you shorten it, the voltage might drop to 19 volts to maintain that arc. Well, that welder recognizes, hey, there's a drop in voltage up the amperage. So the lower the voltage goes, the higher the amperage goes. As it detects, say, a drop to 18 volts, it might bump it up to 110 or 115 amps from 100. That does two things. One, it allows you to melt away the base material and chew in there really good, which is a plus, increasing penetration. And two, it prevents you from sticking the rod. Because normally if you keep pushing the rod in, the reason that it sticks is that your arc gap essentially goes to zero and the rod just connects to the molten puddle and then it passes current through it. Well, by having a higher arc force setting, you're going to really have to push the rod in order to get it to stick. It's just going to keep increasing amperage and blow that connection apart, so it's just not going to stick. The other thing too that the increase in arc force does, besides preventing the rod from sticking, it gives you control. And what I mean by that is, if you're welding on a poor fit up, like say something like this, which you can clearly see, and I'll make it a little bit more visible, tight up here, open down here. When you have adjustable arc force, you can set your rod on the colder side and then start it on, say, a tighter gap here, cram it in there to bump the amperage up to where you melt this together. And then as you long arc it, you're going to reduce the amperage to the base setting. So in a better way to describe it, it just gives you more control to increase or decrease amperage. And that's kind of the point of 6010 as well, is that it makes it really easy to fill gaps and bridge gaps because you just have more control. Because remember, with stick welding, you don't have the luxury of a foot pedal. Same thing with MIG. When you run too hot, either you're going to blow a hole, melt off too much, you're going to have to cut out the arc and either adjust your settings, wait for it to cool and start it. You got to do something. Well, 6010, by having that backup to where you tighten the arc and it increases the amperage, it gives you a lot more control over how much you're melting, how fast, your travel speed, all of that. So experienced welders will typically like 6010 rods and higher arc force because of the control it gives you. It allows you to manipulate the puddle in ways that 7018 simply you can't. And you can run high arc force on 7018, but you're going to find it just creates excessive spatter, and due to the nature of the gas that it creates to shield the weld pool, it doesn't really take too well to bumps in amperage. Like, it's not really going to increase your penetration much at all. It's just going to create excessive spatter, I guess. So arc force is generally low with 7018, high for settings on 6010. Well, hopefully that long in the tooth video where I talked entirely too much helped you out with a little bit more understanding of what arc force is. I know this is a very complex subject. I probably explained it in far too much detail. Take what you want out of what I taught you today and keep it, and throw away what you feel is irrelevant. Not really a big deal. But there's a lot to know with this, and my hope is that you can take the knowledge you have now and it will help you understand why certain welding processes work better than others for penetration, and why you want to use arc force, why it's beneficial, why it can be a detriment, and just have a better understanding of welding in general. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, leave them in the comment box. Otherwise, thanks.